for this session. And it's worth saying we hear quite a bit of feedback, so it might be worth everyone just in here to make sure that if they're not speaking, they keep their microphones on mute.
Okay.
Just to make sure that everyone can hear everything. I'm going to pop back to the room, so I've got to chair that one. So I hope you have a great session in here.
Thank you. We'll be competing. We'll be competing against a very tough contender for the audience.
Likewise.
Okay. See you. Thank you. Bye. Okay, I believe it's time. So welcome everybody. This is the second scheduling session. I'll be sharing it. So we have 3 presentations and 90 minutes overall, so 30 minutes for each. I leave speakers the freedom to finish a bit earlier to have some time for questions or exhaust the 30-minute window. The first speaker is Laszlo Csato. He will be speaking about analyzing the restricted assignment problem of the group draw in sports tournaments. Laszlo? You can share your screen now.
So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so first advertisement. We heard some talks yesterday on how to rank sport tournaments when the season cannot resume, and I have written an article on this topic. Yesterday, 2 speakers mentioned this paper, and it appeared in a Journal of Management Mathematics this month. But now I will talk another topic, which is analyzing the restricted assignment problem of the group draw in sports tournaments. So this is the outline of my talk. I will introduce the problem. I will discuss a case study, the European qualifiers for the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Then I will describe the algorithmic background of this assignment problem, analyze the group draw of this particular tournament, suggest 2 alternative draw procedures, and summarize my talk. Okay, so what is the group assignment problem? A lot of tournaments are organized with a group stage. The teams are assigned to groups subject to some criteria, and the assignment is provided by a draw system that satisfies some criteria. It is so UEFA organizes a number of such tournaments with group stages, and it uses a particular draw procedure. The teams are divided into seeding pots based on a ranking. The ranking is based on past performance of the teams, usually. Okay, and so there are some pots, and the balls representing the teams in the pot are placed in an arm and drawn randomly. And the teams are assigned to the groups in alphabetical order, but if a draw restriction applies or is anticipated to apply, the drawn team is assigned to the first available group as indicated by a computer program to avoid any dead end, which is a situation when the teams still to be drawn cannot be assigned to the empty slots. We will see some examples of this, of such dead ends. Okay, and what is our main contributions? Tournaments draws has been recently analyzed in the literature, but they focus mostly on FIFA World Cup and UEFA Champions League round of 16. In the first case, in the FIFA World Cup, the host nation and the strongest teams were assigned to different groups, and the remaining teams were drawn randomly such that geographic separation was maximized. For example, at most one South American team can be in a group. Okay, but our example is a more complicated one, the European qualifiers to the next FIFA World Cup. Okay, so our example is more complicated than the FIFA World Cup draw because the latter does not require backtracking. And it is also more complicated than the Champions League round of 16 draw because the number of feasible solutions here is much larger, and the complexity of backtracking is also higher. Okay, so we will evaluate the transparency and fairness of the UEFA mechanism used for drawing the groups and suggest two alternative procedures to increase uncertainty during the draw. Okay, so first we will discuss the qualification tournaments. 55 national teams are allocated to 6 seeding pots on the basis of the November 2020 FIFA rankings. And they have to be divided into 10 groups. The first 5 groups consist of 5 teams, one from the first 5 pots, and the second 5. Okay, so groups from F to G consist of 6 teams, one from pots 1 to 6 each. The group winners qualify for the next World Cup, and the group runners-up go to the playoffs. Okay, but during the draw, there are also some special constraints which aim to issue a schedule that is fair and fulfills the expectation of stakeholders. Okay, so what are these draw constraints? There are 4 types of constraints. The first type is competition-related reasons. 4 participants of the UEFA Nations League finals, Belgium, France, Italy, and Spain, should play some matches in another tournament, so they should be drawn into the first 5 groups, which consist of only 5 teams, so they should play less matches in their groups. Okay, the second type of condition is because of political reasons, some matchups are prohibited, for example, between Gibraltar and Spain, Kosovo and Serbia, or Russia and Ukraine. Okay, there are also some restrictions because of winter weather. 10 countries are identified with the risk of severe winter conditions, and the maximum of 2 such countries can be in the same group. Furthermore, the Faroe Islands and Iceland have the highest risk of winter conditions, so these teams cannot play in the same group. This is analogous to a prohibited clash. And finally, the last type of draw constraints is because of excessive travel. 20 country pairs are identified with excessive travel relations, and the maximum of 1 such pair can be in a group. So Kazakhstan is identified as a relatively far from a number of countries, including England or Portugal, and there are also some other pairs. However, some conditions are automatically guaranteed by the allocation of the seeding pots. For example, Spain has to play in one of the first 5 groups because of competition-related reasons, and Gibraltar is in pot 6, so it should be in a larger group of 6. Thus, the prohibited clash between Gibraltar and Spain cannot be effective. Okay, some words about the theoretical background of the problem. So theoretically, it is possible to check all permutations of the initial draw order. We have 5 pots with 10 teams each, and 1 pot with 5 teams each. So we have a very large number of possible solutions, and theoretically it is possible to check all permutations of this order, such that the first permutation, which satisfies all constraints, is the solution to the assignment problem. Okay, so the interesting thing here is that generating all permutations of a sequence is a well-known problem in computer science, and so there are a number of suggestions how to generate these permutations, and the order, which is implied by the UFR rule, has been presented in 2001 in this paper by Mirvoid and Rasko. Naturally, we will not find the solution through this permutation generation, but via standard backtracking procedure. So if the remaining teams cannot be assigned to the empty slots in any order such that all restrictions are satisfied, then the last drawn team is placed in the next available group. Sorry, is there any question? Okay. Okay, so this is an illustration how these permutations should be checked. So the first team, this orange one, is first placed in group A, and it can be, so it should be assigned to another group only if no permutation of the remaining 6 teams can lead to a feasible solution. Okay, so in this case with 4 teams, we have 24 permutations, and we should check them in this order. Okay, now we turn to the analysis of this particular tournament. First, we have counted the maximum number of unavailable groups for the teams. If, however, we do not consider the competition-related restrictions in the first pot because they are transparent and we think they are easy to understand for the public. Okay, so we can see that there are some restrictions affecting pot 3 and pot 4 and pot 6, but the most restrictions affect the 5th pot, which contains Armenia, Cyprus, Faroe Islands, and so on. Okay, so we turn to the draw, and we can see that transparency might be threatened when the draw constraints are only anticipated to apply. Okay, so consider an example. Assume that the first 4 pots are already emptied, and Group H contains Portugal, Ukraine, Iceland, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. The draw continues with pot 5. Armenia is drawn and assigned to the first group, Group A. Cyprus is drawn and assigned to the second group, Group B. Andorra, a team without any draw constraints, is drawn and placed in Group H because no other team from this pot can play here. So this situation is a bit worrying because the fans of Andorra know that there are no constraints for Andorra, so probably they will not understand why Andorra is placed this group instead of the first group in the first empty group in alphabetical order, Group C. Okay, so we call such a situation as a necessary reassignment, and we have calculated the probability of these necessary reassignments when the team is drawn as second, third, and so on. And we have calculated these probabilities for pot 5 and pot 6, and we can see that Andorra cannot be placed in the first available group with a probability of about 2.5%. There are 8 other teams in pot 5 that cannot be placed in the first available group with a probability of more than 1%, and 3 teams in the last pot, Moldova, Liechtenstein, and San Marino, cannot be placed in the first available group with a probability of 1%. Okay, so this was about the threats to transparency. And another important issue is the distortion of this draw procedure. Okay, so consider the following example. We have three groups, A, B, C, and 3 teams, 1, 2, 3. But the second team 2, cannot be placed in Group B. Okay, so in a perfect, in an evenly distributed draw, the second team should play in Group A and Group C with the same probability, which is 50%. However, the UEFA mechanism assigns team 2 to Group A with a probability of 1/3 and to Group C with a probability of 2/3. Okay, so this illustration shows that the UEFA mechanism does not coincide with the perfect evenly distributed draw, which is a random choice among all valid group assignments. So in order to assess the fairness of the UEFA mechanism, we compare it with an ideal mechanism, random choice among all valid assignments. Both rules are simulated 10 million times, and we have calculated the chance of playing in the same group for each pair of teams. Okay, so we focus on the highest increases and decreases in the probability to play in the same group as caused by the UEFA procedure. So in this slide we can see the highest increases with the both of the teams in parentheses, and we can see that the probability that the Faroe Islands and Kosovo play in a group with 6 teams, so they play against a team from pot 6, is increased by about 3.5%. Okay, and the distortion mainly affects the lower ranked teams. These are the highest decreases. We can see that the probability that Andorra is assigned to a group with 6 teams is decreased by about 3.5%. Okay, what are the sporting effects of these distortions? It is not exactly clear, because first, it is more difficult to qualify from a larger group of 6, but it is clear that such teams, Kosovo, Faroe Islands, and Andorra, has no reasonable chance to qualify for the World Cup. So perhaps they are happy if there is a weaker opponent in the group. Okay, so this was the analysis of this particular example. And finally, we can conclude that the UEFA procedure can eliminate uncertainty too early. Through an example, suppose that we have 4 groups, A, B, C, D, and 4 teams drawn in this order. Then the third team, but the third team cannot be assigned to Group C. Okay, so the first team is placed in Group A, the second in Group B, but after that the draw is deterministic because the third team should play in Group D and the fourth team should play in Group C. Okay, so this is a disadvantage of the UEFA procedure, and we suggest 2 other mechanisms to increase uncertainty, which can avoid such a deterministic solution too early. Okay, so I conclude. What are the key messages of my talk? The restricted group assignment problem is linked to generating all permutations of a given sequence of values, and we have shown how this particular procedure of permutation generation is known in computer science. After that, we have analyzed the case study, the European qualifiers for the next FIFA World Cup. We have revealed the implications of the draw constraints. We have evaluated threats to transparency, and we have compared the UEFA draw procedure to the evenly distributed random draw. And finally, we propose two alternative solutions to the problem that can increase uncertainty during the draw. Okay, a short version of the paper is available in the proceedings of the conference, and the full version is freely available on archive. And thanks for your attention. Naturally, all questions are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laszlo. So that was perfect timing. We have more than 5 minutes for questions. So I'd like to open the floor to participants in case they have questions. Is there any question? Well, in the meantime, I can probably ask myself, so what would you have to say about this increasing rumor, or, you know, if not rumor, at least discussion, that probably there are too many games in these qualifying rounds, right? And that we should probably have like 2 categories for sort of weak teams that will qualify themselves to a further. Could you somehow extend your research agenda to account for this possible 2-stage process in this grouping stages?
Okay, so sorry. So can you repeat the main question?
Yeah, so I guess what I'm guessing is that rather than having the whole pool of participants in, say, Europe to qualify for the tournament, you could have like a second division in which weak teams would, you know, play themselves to qualify to participate with these stronger teams in a sort of second round before the that would actually be the qualifiers. So obviously that would sort of split the problem in 2, but at the same time the dimension could be lower at each of these stages, right? For this grouping system. Do you have any rough idea of how much more difficult this would become with respect to the standard situation right now?
I don't know, sorry. So okay, so why is it different from the problem analyzed here? So
well, if you disentangle the problem in 2 stages, so you would have a smaller sample of teams for the first stage, and therefore there would be less restrictions, for instance, in terms of, I don't know, distances or political reasons to come up with the groups in that stage. And then you would go for the second one, which again would have less. So what I'm trying to say is that you would increase the dimension of the problem by having these 2 stages, but at the same time, each of the 2 stages individually would be reducing the number of constraints. I don't know whether there would be a way
okay,
of...
So the problem is that that you know that this analysis is so this is a practically oriented analysis. So we have a fixed set of constraints, and then we can calculate something. But if the set of constraints changes, then naturally for example, the distortions also changes, but it is not clear how. So it it is a great challenge how these type of distortions can be evaluated theoretically.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Is there any other question?
Okay, then thank for your attention and
thank you, Laszlo. So then let's move to the second speaker. Even though we should start on time to keep the schedule. Second speaker could be Nicolas Garcia Aramouni, who is going to talk about sports scheduling and managerial aspects, insights from Argentina's National Basketball League. So if you don't mind, Nicolás, let's wait one more minute.
Yes,
to start on time, in case that someone might want to switch from one session to the other, right? So, okay.
Great.
But you can start sharing your screen
Yes.
if you want. Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, so I believe it's time already, Nicolás.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Nicolas Garcia. This is my first conference, so really happy to be here. I'm going to present this work that we did with Juan José Miranda Bront that started as my master's degree thesis called Sports Scheduling and Managerial Aspects, Insights for Argentina's National Basketball League, in which we're going to try to propose an alternative model for the current scheduling system for Argentina's National Basketball League. So before talking about that, let's talk a bit about the Argentina National Basketball League, which is the top league of one of the most popular sports in Argentina, which has had a rise in popularity since the start of the 21st century due to the success of the national team and the success of national players, for example, in the NBA. Okay, so the LNB, Argentina's National Basketball League, has had a major evolution starting in 2014. So before that, before the 2014-15 season, schedules were made up manually, and the way schedules were built were based on couples. So basically, two teams were coupled together, and they traveled together throughout the tournament, playing against different rivals, and then obviously they played against each other. So there were 16 teams, just with games on Fridays and Sundays, and there were 4 games against teams of the same conference and 2 games against teams of the other conference. Starting in the 2014-15 season, the schedule was started to be created with a mathematical model, leaving the games per rival unchanged, but creating a team-based tournament. So the schedule of mathematical model was based on teams, increasing the number of teams to 18, and instead of having just games on Fridays and Sundays, the league introduced tours, basically having games potentially on every weekday, like imitating the NBA due to Argentina being a large country, as in the USA. So potential team could play, for example, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and then return home. The next season, the system was basically the same, but the number of teams was increased to 20. And as this particular system was having a lot of games, starting the 2017-18 season, the number of games per rival was changed from a regional stage and a national stage to a double round robin of a national stage. So basically, instead of having more games against you from the same conference, now there's 2 games against everybody. So this passing from the manual system before the 2014 season to the mathematical model. Basically, when we see the results implemented by Guillermo Duran and his team, we have a 31% decrease in distance per away match and a approximate 50% travel cost reduction. However, there are certain things that make us believe that we can improve the existing solution because we can change a bit the strategy in the way the schedule is created. So there are two main reasons that make us believe that the system can be improved. First is the inconvenience of setting matches on every weekday. If we think about that, that may result in a decrease in match attendance. And when we had some informal talks with some of the teams that participate on the league, they told us that sometimes people don't know where matches are being held, right? Because they're potentially every day, and that people can go basically maybe 3 times a week to see matches on stadium, right? And also when we evaluate the share of matches per weekday of other leagues other than the NBA, we see that there's usually a higher share on the weekends. Basically, when we see countries like Australia, like France, like Greece, like Italy and Spain, when we see the percentage of match days on the weekends, weekends usually have a higher share than the rest of the week. But also there's a more conceptual difference. That's basically the LNB and the NBA are pretty different, and there are several reasons that make us believe that the same system cannot be applied in both leagues, even though countries, Argentina and USA, are really large. First is the global and local impact. If we think about the NBA has a global fan base with fans all over the world, while Argentina's basketball league, the main core of the fans are fans of the local community, and we have to think that teams here in Argentina have also a great local impact on its community, so we might want to increase the number of people going to the matches. Also, there are some economic differences, not only of the teams, if we think about the huge salaries that are being paid, for example, on the NBA, but also the countries. Argentina is a developing country with some inequalities throughout its provinces. So that make us believe that maybe the same system cannot be applied in a developed country in the USA and a country like Argentina. And also, if we think about the NBA schedule, even though there are tours, there are a greater number of games against rivals that are close. If you think, for example, the Los Angeles Lakers, they play more games against the Los Angeles Clippers, which are in the same city, compared to the ones they play against, for example, the New York Knicks that are in the other coast. So these three differences and the inconvenience of setting matches on every weekday make us believe that the system can be improved to generate a schedule that's more business consistent with the situation. Okay, so we identified our reasons why we might want to change our schedule, the schedule design. What do we propose as an alternative model? Basically, we propose a system that's similar to the one that existed before the 2014-15 season, but made basically through a mathematical model instead of doing manually. So it's a return to the couple-based tournament due to two reasons. One, because people know it, so it might increase the number of people going into the stadiums, and also because when we think about couples, it reduces the complexity of the model, because instead of making a couple a schedule for n teams, we're making a schedule for n divided 2 couples, and then we translate it into a team-based tournament. With games on the schedule should have games on Fridays and Sundays in order to increase the number of people that go into the stadiums and make something that people can remember when the games are being held. And as two-stage tournament, basically with a double round-robin regional stage and a single round-robin national stage, in order to basically have more games against rivals that are close. So now that we have what we propose for our schedule, how we're going to compare our model with the existing one. So we compared our model with the existing one in 3 different dimensions. One is expected profits that should be impacted by the level of attendance. The interest level distribution, as this is something that we're going to see, but maybe in the tournament design, the league wants to have an impact on the distribution of interesting matches throughout the tournament and total distance. Okay, so let's talk more about the expected profits and the interest level distribution to see how did we calculate it. Basically, for expected profits, we have our ticket price, our fixed cost per match, our cost per kilometer traveled, as basically Argentina is a country with a lot of inflation. to have a comparable measure. We used inflation indexes and exchange rates in order to calculate expected profits in nominal dollars. And basically, we introduce some assumptions on a variable match attendance. So we assume a 100% attendance for the most popular teams, a 75% attendance of 50% of the teams, because when we have these informal talks with the teams, basically there were 15% of the teams that we talked with, were happy with the current system, and they mentioned that basically they were having a 75% attendance. And for the rest of the teams, some that we talked about, they mentioned that they were having a 50% attendance on the weekends and 30% attendance on the rest of the weekdays. Okay, why and about the interest level distribution? Why do we want to measure the interest level, right? So when we think about a match that is interesting, it's a match that should be close in the at least the final minutes, like when we introduce, for example, the concept of clutch, and that should have an impact on the final outcome of the team in the league, right? So, for example, if two teams that are playing for maybe the final spots on the playoffs, if they play, for example, in the last day of the tournament, that should be really interesting because that match should be close, and that match is going to have a huge impact in the way the final result of the team on the final standings, right? So we introduce a metric that tries to calculate the interest of a match between two teams. So this metric basically is positively correlated to a binary constant that indicates if teams I and J are rivals, and has on the denominator this difference between VI and VJ. So this VI indicates the ranking of team I. So we use last season standings for the ranking, but basically, if two teams are closely ranked, they should be equally. They should have an equal strength, and the game should be interesting. So basically, if we think that they are equally strength, the game should be interesting, and it should have a positive impact on the interest level, right? So as the league might want to have an impact and have a decision on the interest level distribution of matches, we introduce this constant for mathematical models. Okay, so we have our league structure and the metrics that we will use to measure it. How do we build a mathematical model? So basically, we have our coupling system that basically puts teams into couples. To generate couples, we use a mean weight matching algorithm where weights are computed as distances. And for the model, basically, let's think about that we generate a schedule for a regional stage double round robin, basically for teams of the same conference. And we introduce variable ijt that is equal to 1 if couple I plays at home against couple J on weekend T. So when we think about the sets of our model, we have our set of teams, our set of couples that are couples of the Northern and the Southern Conference. And for the time slots, we have our set of weekends, when we introduce two dummy weekends indicating the start and end of the tournament, the number of weekends with matches, and we introduce our set of weekends with matches, weekends of the first round and the second round, and basically our set of these weekends with matches. Some of them are intra-couple weekends, because even though we're setting up a model at the couple level, couple teams of the same couple are rivals and they have to play against each other, and we fix them basically on the start on each round, and our set of inter-couple weekends. Okay, so we talked about the interest level distribution and how the league might want to have a say on that. So basically, we'll introduce a objective function that tries to impact this. And to do this, we set up the constraint of the interest level at a couple level because we define it at a team level. If we think of couple A and couple B, if A is equal to B, basically the interest at a couple level of A and B is 4 times the interest at a team level. And if A is different to B, the interest at a couple level is basically the sum of the 4 matches between the teams of couples A and B. So basically, we define our first objective function that tries to maximize interest on the latest match days. Why is this? For example, of the example that I mentioned before, if we think that there are some set of interesting matches that are close, are going to have a great impact on the potential final classification of the teams, we may want to put that into the latest match days, because it's going to be really interesting. Because if two teams are playing for the final spot in the playoffs, if they play in the latest match days, that should be a match that everyone should be interested to watch. Okay, so our objective function tries to maximize basically for each teams and in each match the match assignment variable multiplied by this CIJT, which is basically this interest at a couple level calculation multiplied by T to ponderate for the number of the weekend. Okay, so we have our model with a set of constraints, the set of constraints that indicate the intra-couple start and end weekends, a constraint that indicates one match per weekend to make it a possible schedule. Some constraints which limit consecutive home and away matches. These are parity constraints and are similar to the ones we would use. For example, if we set up the number of breaks to the minimum, we use this particular set of constraints because they were used in a paper written to schedule the Argentina's volleyball league, which are also made at a couple level. And also because when we think about setting up schedule, this set of constraints is easier to find a feasible solution than when we try to use the set of constraints that minimizes breaks. And also we put some constraints on matches per rivals, basically that indicate that the rivals should play once in the first round, twice in the whole tournament, and if they play twice, that they should play once in each stadium. And these would be the constraints that we would change if we want to pass, for example, from a double round robin to a single round robin and so on. Okay, but we thought about also another objective function that tries to have an impact on interest level distribution. So if we think about the objective function that we talked before, that objective function may have a portion of the tournament that is not interesting, right? So another option is basically try to define a new objective function which tries to minimize the variation of the interest, throughout the tournament to make it as even as possible. So we define our variable set, which is equal to the total interest of the least interesting weekend. And in order to make it to relate this to the existing model, we introduce a new set of variables which will relate this objective function to the match assignment variables. Basically, we define that for each weekend with matches, we have the interest of sets is minor or equal to the interest of each weekend. Okay, so we have our mathematical model and we have our KPIs that we're going to use to measure against the existing solution. Let's do that in order to see what's going on. So basically, to get a better understanding of the performance of our solution against the original one, we run extensive competition experiments for six seasons. Basically, for all seasons from the 2012-13 to the 2018-19, except for the 2014-15 season because it had 18 teams and the number of couples would be odd. For seasons 17-18 and 18-19, we changed the number of games per rival. Remember that there we had a double round robin system to have more games against teams that are close, right? So to have 4 games against teams of the same couple, 3 games against teams of the same conference that are not the same couple, and 1 game against team of the other conference. For the rest of the seasons, for the models, we left our number of games per rival unchanged. However, remember that prior to the 2017-18 season, there were more games against teams of the same conference. So basically, that means that for all the 6 seasons that we analyzed, there are more games against rivals that are close. Okay, so first let's talk about distance. Here we have our percentage change in total distance against the original schedule. On the light blue is the objective function that maximizes interest on the latest match days, and the pink one we have the one that minimizes variation on the interest level distribution. So that what we see, remember, starting in the 2015 season, we have seasons that are made mathematically with tours. So in the first 2 seasons, we see a reduction from distance coming from the fact that in these seasons we had a manual system. So basically using a mathematical model to make the couples and to make the schedule is generating a reduction in distance. For the next 2, we are not seeing improvement in our model. Basically, the tour-based system helps to reduce distance, especially in the 2015-16 season. And in the next ones, as we're changing the number of games per rival, this makes us have a lower distance than the existing solution, as we're having more games against teams that are close. Okay, for the expected profit analysis, here we have the same, the percentage change expected profits against the original schedule. The light blue is the one that maximizes interest on the latest match days, and the pink one is the one that minimizes variation of interest. For the first one, as we're having this distance reduction, even though there are more games on the weekends, especially here before the setting up of the tour system, as we're having a distance reduction, we're getting higher expected profits. For the next 2 seasons, as we're having more games on the weekend, the additional income from having more games on the weekend and having a higher match attendance compensates for the fact that we're having greater distances traveled. And for the next 2, as we're having this combined effect, right? Because we're having a greater income from the distance reduction, from the having more games on the weekend, sorry, and a lower cost because we're having a distance reduction thanks to having more games against teams that are close by. So we have our expected profits and our distance analysis. Let's talk a bit more about the interest level distribution and how does that look, right? So here we have the interest level distribution for one particular season, for the 2015-16. A more intense color and a darker color indicates that the interest level of that particular weekend is higher. So for the original solution, we see that there's no particular pattern. However, when we try to maximize interest on the latest match days, we see like this increasing pattern across every stage and every round, which indicates that we're getting what we want. And when we try to minimize the variation of the interest distribution, we see like this kind of constant colors throughout the tournament, which indicates that interest is being kind of constant, and that we basically, with the 2 objective functions that we defined, we're getting what we want in the one maximizing interest on the latest match days, and on the other one minimizing the variation of interest. Okay, so for our conclusions, our future work, we build upon the solution proposed by Guillermo Duran and his team, considering an alternative model. This model indicates new variables, generating an efficient and business consistent schedule. This schedule that we have produced has higher expected profit and acceptable distance levels. And about this, we have to talk a bit about the couple-based system because it has proven to be useful due to 2 main reasons. Why? Is because, as we mentioned, as we are reducing the complexity, it reduces computational time, and because it makes it easy to pursue non-distance related objectives. Here we talked about interest level distribution, but we can change it to the thing we want, while keeping distance in acceptable levels as we are creating couples based on distance between the teams. And also, the system that we mean, even if we were having games on the weekends, it means that we are introducing too much tours, because basically we are assuming that after if teams play on Friday and Sunday, that after Sunday they can return home. Okay, for our future work, even though we are proposing games just on Fridays and Sundays, the fact is that tours have been in the league for basically 7 years, and that they have produced an impact on reducing distance. So it might be useful to incorporate tours even if in a time constrained schedule, when we think about, for example, setting up a specific number of weekends, for example, with tours. And also, we talked about the party constraints in a particular way. If we want maybe to make a schedule as fair as possible, we might want to incorporate the constraints that set up the number of breaks to the minimum in order to make the schedule as fair as possible. Okay, so thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it, and happy to answer any of your questions or connect with you later as well.
Thank you, Nicolás. Again, perfect timing. We have a lot of time for questions, so I'll just open the floor to participants. Is there any question?
Let me just ask one question.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Tankut from Bahçeşehir University in Turkey. You mentioned that this couple-based formulation made pursuing non-distance related objectives more conveniently.
Yeah.
Why couldn't you pursue other types of objectives with your previous formulation or with non-couple based formulations?
Yeah, so for example, when we try to do this same schedule at a team level instead of doing at a couple level, for example, minimizing the interest level distribution, we are getting a interest level distribution that is more constant if we think about setting up at a team level than at a couple level. The thing is, teams would travel a lot throughout the tournament, throughout the country. The truth is, if we are making at the couple level, as we are making teams on a one weekend play against two teams that are close by, so that makes it easy to pursue another objective without, because if we set up at a team level and not put for example, not put a maximum quota on total distance, an upper bound, sorry, on total distance, the total distance that will result from that model would be huge. So in that way, when we introduce couples and putting teams that are close to each other in a same couple, we make the schedule we make a schedule that we can incorporate these other objectives while not making teams travel a lot in a particular weekend. I don't know if that was clear enough.
Okay, I got. Just a quick follow-up question. When a couple plays among each other, how many games do they play?
Yeah. So in this particular setup, they play, for example, in a particular intra-couple weekend, they play just once because we are setting up two intra-couple weekends, but that could be changed to a single intra-couple weekend when they visit each other.
No, but because in the objective function you had 4 times the interest level.
Yeah. Sorry, let me go that, and that's because to avoid any trivial solution. Because if we think about this, this intra-couple weekend would have a lower number of matches, right? So instead of having a lower interest just because we're having lower number of matches, we're just multiplying this by 4 in order to avoid a trivial solution. But it is true that it has less matches.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
I believe Georgios raised his hand. So Georgios, can you go ahead, please?
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it because I like basketball myself. My question is the following. I wonder how viable a model for a sport like basketball is to have the vast majority of the games organized during the weekend, when there is research, at least in European settings, which shows that there are pretty substantial substitution effects caused by football games scheduled at around the same time. So if we increase the number of basketball games during the weekend, then probably the demand for these basketball games will be lower because football is sport number 1. And I guess this applies also for Argentina.
Yeah, great point about that. Yeah, we thought a bit about that. The truth is also that the teams that play sometimes on the like the clubs that play and the cities that have teams on the basketball league are not the same at some cases that the ones that have teams on the football league. So, for example, the basketball league is also a league that even though that may happen, the truth is we don't. For example, the basketball league is a more federal league because there are more games. There are more teams of some provinces that, for example, don't have teams on the football league. So even though that may happen, if we think about the clubs that participate on the Argentina's national basketball league, as they are clubs that are not sometimes participating on the football league, that impact may not be as huge as for some teams that maybe have a club playing also in the football league. So yeah, that may be considered, but it is possible that may make a reduced effect.
Exactly. So this is a point that perhaps you should consider also in your paper, in your idea, because the substitution effects are not happening also from teams coming from the same city. So, for example, substitution effects in as far as demand is concerned, but substitution effects are also occurring when the football game of a very popular team is televised. So the fans prefer to watch Boca against River Plate than see a very interesting, also in the final stage, basketball game, I guess.
Yeah. So yes, that's something that yeah we should look at it. Yeah, we maybe consider. Yeah. Thank you for the suggestion.
You're welcome.
Any other question? Oh yes, David, please go ahead.
Hi, hello. Many thanks for your nice presentation. I have a small question about going back to the coupled formats. When they return back from the round robin to couples, are you not afraid that the carryover effect might raise quite strongly? Because let's say, for instance, that you couple a team A, which is a very strong team, with a team B. Then if they always play against each other, then B might have an advantage because the opponent already played against the very strong team A. So what do you think about the effect on the carryover?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we're exploring that in order to see in our future work to see the effects of that. Also, if there are a lot of a huge disadvantage, that might be included into the coupled algorithm. So if we think that there's a lot, for example, a lot of a disadvantage of one team against each other, we can, for example, in the weighting algorithm, basically ponderate that weight against using, for example, the level of unparity. But also, when we if it is something that already existed before, and also if we think about, for example, the NBA, that's something that also happens. So it's something that is possible, and that we can take a look into that in the weighting algorithm if we think that if we want to incorporate this at a real scale.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to you.
Thank you, Nicolás. So it's about time, but actually I'll use some of my time to ask you a final question. So regarding this interest function, as far as I understood, it's essentially driven by the table standing, so to speak, right? By the ranking position. So what about introducing something related to the fan base of each of the teams, right?
Yeah, exactly. We talked with Juan about how we could model this interest level distribution, and this ranking again is just a proxy. But yeah, there's a lot of things that may be used. For example, these ranks don't take into account maybe the incorporations that a team does throughout the off season. So that's something that we can also include, or also as you mentioned, the fan base. For example, if we think about football, Boca, even though even if it has maybe a low, not a good result, it's going to have a lot of impact and a lot of fans wanting to see the model, see the match, because it is a popular team. So yeah, again, this was just a proxy, but again, there's a lot of things that we can incorporate in order to make it as real as possible to this interest calculation.
Very good. Thank you very much. So I
you.
believe it's time for me now to move on. Maybe do you have to, yes. Okay, so I'll. Okay, so the paper that I'm going to present is broadcasting La Liga. This happens to be a different La Liga from the one that Nicolás was presenting before. This is the Spanish Football League, and I apologize because I didn't know that I was going to have an Argentina in the same session to create this possible confusion. This is actually a next stage in a research agenda in which I've been involved with Gustavo Bergantiños, game theorist from Spain, for the last years, and we've published some papers already within this research agenda, but they've mostly been theoretical research. So essentially what we do in this paper is to take this theoretical apparatus to try to provide an empirical application for this specific case of the Spanish Football League. And as sort of motivation, I guess you're all aware that in the aftermath of COVID-19 lockdown, there were these huge efforts to resume competitions worldwide, and in particular, this was the case of most of European football leagues and also worldwide. And these efforts were actually controversial because it's actually in the news today here in Spain that people will be allowed back to the stadiums in the upcoming season. I mean, there's been already some people in the stadiums in Europe for the current Euro 2021, but apparently the next edition of the Spanish Football League will come back to normal. But in the middle of this sort of controversy, there was this huge push towards securing these broadcasting contracts that were crucial to the way in which football leagues, to be more precise, football clubs are running lately, right? So it's by far the major source of income, and therefore it was truly crucial. Now let me give you a few hints about the Spanish Football League for those of you who are not aware of it. And I have to take you back to 2014, because that was a year before the Spanish government decided to intervene this market. And the reason why they decided to intervene was these official barometers that were published back then, providing some interesting features of the Spanish Football League. One of them was here saying that half of Spanish citizens were interested in football. And funnily enough, more than that, actually 2/3 declared themselves followers of a certain club. This is actually connected to the probably political reality in Spain that essentially reflects that there's something more than just playing a game, right, when it comes to football. Okay, 3/4 of those acknowledged to watch their club's games on TV whenever they could, right? So we're talking about a big thing here in Spain. And another important and crucial factor that was a driving force towards this regulation was the fact that the two powerhouses, both Barcelona and Madrid, were essentially combined, were essentially getting half of the pie. What I mean by the pie, I mean the overall amount that was obtained by broadcasting this game. And this was in stark contrast with all the European football leagues and with North American sports. But in the case of European football, let me actually give you here the picture. So back then in 2015, as I said, so essentially there was half of the pie for the top two teams in Spain, whereas in France, Germany, and the UK, this was much, much less, to the extent that it was, at least in the UK, it was very close to equal sharing, right? This was obviously, contested in Spain by small clubs, and that prompted this intervention by the Spanish government. But the intervention was by no means minor, to the extent that there was this 18-page long royal decree in the official bulletin of the Spanish state that was setting the guidelines for this regulation. And the most important one was the first one that was forcing this collective sale of broadcasting rights. That wasn't the case up to then, right? But then this obviously motivated this obvious second step problem, which is once you raise collectively some amount of money, how do you allocate it among the participating teams? And that's precisely the most interesting aspect we found to embark upon this agenda. But it turns out that royal decree was also providing specific guidelines as to how to share this amount. And it was interesting to the extent that it was trying to combine two main goals that are normally, driven in distributed justice. So on the one hand, there was this idea of rewarding performance, so to speak, and at the same time, trying to deal with this sort of distributed justice in the process, right? So for that extent, there were like three dimensions distinguished, namely sport outcomes, also economic performance in the sense in terms of ticket sales, and at the same time, the relative contribution, so to speak, to generate resources. The way this is then specified by the way we take it is that this last dimension is precisely the importance that each of the participating clubs has into determining the audiences that at the end of the day would be crucial to obtain more or less resources when it comes to selling broadcasting rights. Okay, but it's a more difficult dimension to address, and I'll be saying a few more things about it. On top of that, the Spanish government was also imposing that 1/2 of the total endowment had to be shared equally. 1/4 had to be shared to sport performance on the pitch, and only 1/12 was shared according to economic performance in terms of ticket sales in the last seasons. And finally, the residual was supposed to be allocated according to this broadcasting performance dimension, so to speak. And somewhat surprisingly, La Liga, so the Spanish Football League Association, was somewhat silent about the way in which this sizable portion of the budget of the endowment was to be allocated, except for very rough and basic guidelines, which are the ones I have in here. Okay, so the goal of this paper that I'm presenting here today is to scrutinize each of the aspects of this scheme proposed by the National Football League and try to argue that based on well-known contributions in the literature on distributed justice or the game theory literature, we can actually provide rationalization or not for this scheme that is currently in practice. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar, let me simply say that La Liga is a standard double round-robin tournament involving 20 teams. Each one plays the other twice. There's no playoffs or post-season games, right? And in general, on top of that, it's important that each team, each club is playing one of the other 19 teams twice, once home and once away. And in general, for the last years, these games are located in different time windows, meaning that you potentially could be able to watch all the 10 games per week, right? They normally happen on weekends, except for specific cases, right? And there's the issue, I didn't say this at the beginning, but this is not technically a talk or a paper on scheduling, but there are obviously important ramifications here on scheduling that we don't address, which is like, for instance, how do we allocate these time windows for games involved in the Spanish Football League, right? Because that will obviously be crucial for audiences. So in particular, if you have a prime time slot, right, that will increase the number of viewers with respect to some other slot. Funnily enough, prime time in Spain is not the same as prime time in China or prime time in the US. And that happens to be crucial lately as well, in the sense that La Liga is encouraging everybody to attract viewers from abroad, right? And this is, in that sense, they're trying to compete with the English Premier League, which is by far much more popular abroad, right, than the Spanish Football League. I mean, those are aspects that we're not going to be dealing with in here, but they are definitely crucial for the kind of analysis that we're having. Connected to this, let me simply say that we're going to be focusing on data on national broadcasting, right? There are a few things to say about that, but the most important one is that not all games are broadcasted abroad, whereas all of them are broadcasted nationally, and that's what made us restrict us to that specific case. Now, as I said, being a double round-robin tournament, we could essentially simplify the mathematical apparatus for this analysis. Is going to be very simple, because we could essentially assume that the input of our model is going to be a square matrix, right, indicating the revenues obtained in each of the games played, right? Obviously, we'll have 0 entries in this matrix. And to simplify things further, we're going to assume that there's an equal pay-per-view fee per game. So at the end of the day, the revenues that are generated by each game will be simplified to the number of viewers that each game had, right? So that's a simplifying assumption that will be important here. So what's the model in itself. So we're gonna assume that we have an endowment that will be split in 4 categories. The 4 being the ones that I listed at the beginning in the introduction. One for lower bounds for distributed justice, to guarantee a lower bound for each participating club. Then there's this performance on the pitch, economic performance, and finally broadcasting performance, right? So this is going to be the 4 dimensions, so to speak. As I mentioned before, by default, La Liga is imposing specific splitting, namely one half for the first dimension, 1/4 for the second, 1/12 for the third, and 1/6 for the fourth. We could explore how things would change by having different schemes in here, and I'll get back to that probably later if I have time. So this first table is pretty much summarizing what we have. So I brought in here data from the 17-18 season. That was the previous to one of the last ones before the pandemic, right? That we have full data, and therefore, shouldn't be considered as an outlier, which is the case of the last 2 years. And here you have in the first column, you have all the teams listed. And in the second one, you have the actual amounts that they were obtaining from this scheme from the Spanish Football League Association. And in relative terms, that's the next column. And then you have the other 4 columns are supposed to refer to the 4 categories that I mentioned before, right? So obviously the lower bound is straightforward and trivial. Performance is actually according to the table standings at the end of the last 5 seasons, and there's a proportional scheme according to that. We can easily identify that. Ticket sales is a bit more difficult because we don't have reliable data for the last 5 years. We only have data on season ticket holders, but season ticket holders do not explain all attendance to Spanish stadiums, even though it's a large majority of it, right? But anyhow, so there's a caveat to be made in that dimension. And finally, the last one we've got residual. As I said, the Spanish Football League Association doesn't explain how they actually allocate this portion of the endowment based on the broadcasting performance, so to speak. But we can take it here as the residual from the other dimensions in the way I mentioned before, right? So this is, and this last column, it's going to be crucial when it comes to dealing with that dimension. Okay, so this is pretty much the model that I mentioned before. So the matrix will be the input, and it'll be important to associate with this matrix what we call a claim, this alpha I. This is just supposed to be the aggregate row and column entries for each of the row and columns in the matrix, right? And it's basic algebra to see that the overall amount that you have to allocate is precisely 1/2 the aggregate claim there, right? Okay. Now the first dimension is straightforward. As I said, I won't spend time on that. I'll simply tell you that the benchmark case is to give all of them the same equal sharing of a portion, right? But instead, you could think of what we call reasonable lower bounds, in which you make this lower bound contingent on the performance of these teams, right? And this is what we're saying here. There's a tradition in the literature on distributed justice to come up with this bounds that I'm presenting here, right? So if you look at the table, right, you will see that obviously there's an obvious effect of changing the way in which you compute lower bounds, and the obvious effect is that you discriminate among teams. I have 3 different ways to do that here. In the interest of time, I'll skip that, but let me simply tell you there is an obvious way in which you could make the allocation less equal by changing the lower bounds. Now, what about the second dimension, sport performance? So as I said, you take the last 5 seasons and you give 35% for the last one, 20% for the previous 2 last, and 15% to the other 3, right? So you take all the table standings in the last 5 seasons, you weighted them according to this scheme, and you allocate the 1/4 of the overall endowment you have proportionally according to this weighted scoring. You could take a different approach and say, look, instead of this weighted scoring, I could just think of unweighted table standings, because it happens to be the case that, being first or being second or being third have different scoring schemes, right? But you could have a sort of board account procedure by which you give the same difference between all of the steps in the table standings. Or likewise, you can still use cardinal information, namely the points that each of them had at the end of the season, right? Because some years being second requires, getting 90 points. Some years getting second requires getting 70 points. So you could argue the performance is not the same in both ways. And therefore, there are alternatives to allocate this amount. And here is what I showed you in this table. So you see this is the actual allocation, the second column, whereas the other allocations are alternatives based on the two alternative protocols that I presented before. And one obvious effect that you can see there is that the powerhouses will get much less, right? So there's an interesting trade-off here. In the first dimension, you sort of impose this equal lower bound to try to even all of them, whereas in here in this poor performance, you impose a scheme that encourages more inequality, right? This is probably hidden, and that's might be the reason why it's not evident when you look at this, right? But it happens to be the case, as this table shows, that you encourage inequality by having the actual scheme that is being in practice for this second dimension as opposed to the first one. Okay, economic performance. Here, I don't have that much time, so let me simply say that the actual allocation of this dimension is proportional according to ticket sales, but instead of proportionality, you could take some other well-known rules in the literature of fair allocation, and here I have some of them. Let me simply tell you that they have strong normative grounds, same as proportionality, right? But they are alternatives to proportionality, and again, they could offer much more preservation of interests, either to the small teams or to the strong teams. Depending on the rule you use, you could go one way or the other, right? It's true that in Western societies, proportionality is deeply rooted. It's some sort of synonym of justice, but it doesn't need to be the case, right? So proportionality is one possibility for distributed justice, but it's not the only one. And again, this is aimed to illustrate that. And finally, the broadcasting performance dimension, which is what encouraged us to get into this research agenda, is, we believe, much more interesting. So here we take and I'm going to free write here on our contributions in the previous papers that I mentioned at the beginning. Here we construct rules to allocate an endowment based on the matrix of audiences that we have, right? And the only condition that we impose from the outset is that we fully allocate all we have, right? Now, if we do that, now we could propose some rules, but rather than doing that, we take what is normally known in the literature as the axiomatic approach. So we propose axioms of rules that reflect principles that we find ethically appealing, right? And in particular, if we have a list of axioms like the ones I'm having here, we single out a specific rule, right? Which is what we have in this theorem here, what is called the equal split rule, right? If you have a different list of axioms, you would have a different formula and a different rule, which is what we call consider and divide. And this connects to my my question at the end of the previous talk, because essentially these two rules, equal split and consider and divide, are somewhat polar from each other in the way in which they treat funds, right? So essentially equal split is arguing that it's dismissing the existence of hardcore funds or fan bases, as I mentioned before, whereas consider and divide is encouraging the existence of those at the expense of the existence of neutral viewers or fans, if you want to use that term, right? But because of being somewhat polar and extreme, you could also come up with a compromise among them, right? So you could take a convex combination between these two rules and come up with a whole family of rules that can also be rationalized with this axiomatic approach. So it turns out that this family of rules encompasses the only rule satisfying three specific and very natural axioms in this setting. Anyhow, so if we use these rules, I have this last table, maybe it's smaller than I wished, but let me simply say that here I provide the actual allocation that takes place in the Spanish Football League and compare it with the allocations that our rules could provide, right? First, the equal split in absolute and relative terms, then finally consider and divide, and in the middle, I have the convex combination of these two rules when it's 1/2, 50% equal split, 50% consider and divide. And the last column is we believe very interesting, because it casts doubts on the actual scheme that the Spanish Football League is implementing. In what sense? So here you have three categories of teams. The so-called below category refers to those teams that are badly treated, in the sense that they're getting amounts in real life, they're getting amounts below the lowest possible amount that our family of rules is suggesting. Whereas those being above are getting amounts that are above any possible value that you could get with our rules. And then finally, there is a category of teams for which you could identify the rule that would actually be suggesting the actual amount they get in real life, right? So you see that this, we believe, it's raising concerns about the way in which La Liga is allocating this. Okay, so I wanted to give some time to the audience to discuss this if they want to. So let me just wrap up here by saying that the goal or the aim of this paper was to dig deeper into the way in which the Spanish Football League is allocating the amount that is collectively raised by selling broadcasting rights. And in a nutshell, we could essentially summarize by saying that the scheme in place has a nice aim of combining performance with distributed justice concerns. We believe that that's very intuitive, very natural, and a promising goal. But, and this is a big but, we believe this scheme doesn't seem to be addressing properly the capability that clubs have to generate audiences, which is, at the end of the day, the most important issue, right? Because, you know, these TV stations, these TV companies are paying huge amounts of money because they're hoping this will attract a huge number of viewers, right? So if you don't happen to address that specific part of this problem, it seems that you're, you know, lagging behind, so to speak. Okay, so I believe I have still 5 more minutes, so I'll stop in here. I'll be more than happy to address questions. Yes, there's just a hand there. Yeah, Nicolás, please go. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
So a question about what you mentioned. Do you think that in the future, like we know like this, like maybe traditional way of trying to indicate popularity and viewers and so on, do you think that in the future, maybe the impact of social media and how does maybe that allows the clubs to generate audiences more easily will have an impact on this kind of also economic distribution of the interest of TV or not?
Right. Oh, definitely. And this is, as far as I know, this is already an issue that is supposed to be part of the process. So this fourth dimension, we essentially assume that it's going to be restricted to the capability that these teams have to generate viewers directly. But apparently, they're also trying to bring metrics onto social media. Followers and Twitter followers and things like that will play a role in this process too. Yes, but at the end of the day, what we believe is I mean, if these sort of TV stations would be able to estimate the number of viewers they will have, they would know how to sell the product, so to speak, right? But indirectly, these followers, social media followers, could potentially help into driving higher number of viewers, but it's hard to argue how should that be addressed. But definitely that will be on the agenda, of course. Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Juan de Dios. Yes.
Hello,
Hi,
Juan.
nice to see you again. How are you?
Yes, well, very interesting presentation as usual, and very engaging. I would like to ask you one question about the last table you show with the teams that are above and below.
Yes.
It's just a very simple question. Are above or below according to all the rules, or according to
the family? Yes, exactly. To all the rules in our family, which means that these are all the rules satisfying 3 principles we find very appealing. So if you buy those principles, if you believe the way in which you allocate the amount should be guided by those principles, then you're essentially saying that there's no way that you can explain the allocation that is taking place. So I don't want to say that we would neglect those allocations, but what I'm trying to say is that at the very least, by imposing these allocations, you are violating one of these principles that we believe are important for the allocation process.
Okay, so it's a very, very strong result. Yeah. Okay. The only thing I think it would be interesting, this is not a statistical measure, so you cannot appraise if it's statistically significant above or below.
Right.
But right. I don't know if you have some way to measure if it's too much above or too much below. It could be probably interesting as well.
I honestly haven't thought about that, but that sounds interesting. So let me, I'll try to think about it. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay, is there any other question? So I believe it's almost time then. So let me. Sorry. Yes. I see a hand here. Yeah, Dries, go ahead. Yes.
Just a quick question. How does La Liga respond to your results? Because it's, I mean, how they would be having to explain all this, right?
Yes. So it seems that we're not very good reaching them. Apparently, it doesn't seem that they're reading papers, and actually, our only contact with them was to try to get the data, and eventually they said, no, this is private information. You have to go to the clubs directly. So that was our only interaction. So it's been frustrating in that way. So maybe it's just that we're not good enough reaching people outside academics. But we would love to be able to talk to some people that are in charge of this and see. But maybe, I mean, we conjecture what they have in mind, but it's clear that our approach is at the very least casting doubts on what they're doing, and that's put it this way. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dries. So it's already time, so let me stop here thanking all the speakers and the attendants for this time. See you everybody later for the last session, and thank you for being here. Bye-bye.